Perfect! I've been waiting to test my skills, and so it begins!
At some point, I want to make a series about character archetypes in the Xenogames. I mean, things like the Van Man, the badass sword wielder who always joins the party at some point, but without finishing Xenosaga, I'm gonna have to wait a bit because most of the archetypes I think are relevant to talk about have representatives in every single Xeno universe. I have already made videos on individual members of the sword archetype though, and since I've already done Satan and Nagi, and I don't really want to touch Dunban yet since we might learn more about him in the remake, which is probably coming soon now that it's been ESRB rated, so I really have to get on top of Xenosaga, it is Mòrag's turn today. This will contain spoilers for Torn of the Golden Country as well as the base game of Xenoblade 2. Before I start actually discussing Mòrag, I think it's a good idea to just do a bit of a refresher on her backstory, since it doesn't come up a lot and most of it is hidden in heart-to-hearts and not required cutscenes. When she was born, she was first in line for the throne of Ardainian, and was brought up for several years under the assumption that she was going to become Empress because there was no one else available. However, once her cousin Niall was born, due to inheritance laws, he then became first in line, and she was kicked either to second or completely out of the running. Despite this though, the two of them grew up somewhere in Gorma, spent a lot of time together, and they became very close, to the point where they refer to each other as siblings despite biologically being cousins. We don't exactly know the timeline, but she might have awakened Brigid and started to receive her first combat training before Niall was born, under the assumption that, yeah, it's not really legal for the Emperor to have both of the jewels anymore, but if she's going to be in charge of the country, she should at least have one of them, so she was given Brigid based on something. After Niall was instated as the heir, she instead volunteered to take up the position of Special Inquisitor and become his shield. Now the position itself is different from what it was 500 years ago. Instead of being, oh, I follow the Emperor around and retrieve core crystals if he dies, it's instead the top military advisor in Ardainian, and she does still report directly to Niall. Despite being close to him though, she became completely dedicated to her position and no longer directly treated him as family, in deciding to stick with all the formal roles instead. Also, at some point Niall was also given a Geon, because no one person could have both jewels of the Empire anymore after Hugo died. And then at some point, in between then and the start of the game, she received the title Flamebringer for whatever. It might have just been her fighting style or the fact that she was a powerful driver of Brigid, but it might have been an epithet due to actually doing something specific. Based on that, I think it's pretty easy to tell that a lot of her personality comes from being groomed to be Emperor at a very young age, and retaining a lot of that stuff even after Niall was born and given the position instead. Obviously, her patriotism, her absolute pride in the Emperor come from that, and also the fact that she calls him her brother, but probably one other important aspect of her personality is directly from that too. She tries to, and very much succeeds, at coming off as this powerful, intimidating presence, a terror on the battlefield. She's utmost in her dedication and her duty, and she's not outwardly feminine, but she really, really hates being mistaken for a man. And this almost certainly comes from insecurities or a feeling of having to prove herself when she was intended to be Emperor. Ardainian seems to follow a male-only primogeniture system, wherein male children get priority when it comes to being in line for succession over females, regardless of age. And the only way a woman can possibly inherit the throne is if there are no male family members left to receive the crown. And had Niall not been born, Mòrag would have been the first time there was a female sovereign emperor or an empress of Ardainian. Obviously, there were probably people with the title empress before, but it was the, oh, the king's wife is called the queen, but he has the real power situation. So, a lot of this stuff probably comes from insecurities or a feeling of having to prove herself when she was intended to be the first female ruler of the country. There were probably tons of expectations placed on her, and she probably had to deal with her fair share of people telling her that she could never rule as well as the men, or shouldn't be allowed to rule at all because she isn't one. So this probably led to her both wanting to live up to the masculine ideal of strength, while also being fiercely protective of her own femininity. She dresses in a full uniform at all times, and clearly tries to be the paragon, the ideal soldier, and she does look fairly androgynous, but Pandoria, one of the girliest girls in the game, comes to her for beauty advice because of how much care she and Bridget put into taking care of themselves and their appearances. She has zero tolerance for being objectified. The angriest she gets in the whole fight at the end of chapter 6 is when Mikhail realizes she's a woman and starts getting horny over everything else that happens there. And she doesn't even like being compared to men in general. She's noticeably upset when Fiora says she reminds her of Dunban. Although, to be fair, if she knew the context was, you are both really cool fighters and great heroes and badasses and all that, and not, oh, you're manly, she probably would have been okay with it then. Her whole pride in the Empire and Ardainian honor thing is really interesting, because she is extremely patriotic, she believes wholeheartedly in the Emperor, but unlike most characters like this, she is still capable of acknowledging the wrongs her country has committed. Admittedly, she kinda has to be this way to actually join the party and not completely clash with everyone, because if she went down the more typical, my country is always right even if what they do disagrees with my own personal morality direction, then that kinda goes against a lot of the other party members' outlooks and really wouldn't make her look that great because of what we know Mòrag has done. So that's more of a much more morally gray character or even sympathetic villain outlook as compared to what Mòrag actually is, where she's a lot more reasonable than a lot of characters in this archetype. She outright says that the Senate started the war that led to them gaining sovereignty over Gormott just because they wanted the land. She does not take Roderick going against Niall's wishes to not start a war with Araya lightly. And she never mentions this, but this is just kind of a thing I realized. Hugo knows as a fact that his brother is not a driver. The only characters we've seen try and fail to open a core crystal and survive were all Napon, who are notably more durable than other races. So, 500 years ago, Mòrag must have had a way of safely determining whether or not someone had aptitude. And then in the present day, the army's just set up in the middle of Torgoth and is like, hey, if you Gormati want enough money to be able to live, then come try to awaken this core crystal. You'll either join the military and fight for the empire that forcibly took over your land, or you'll die trying, haha. I doubt she had anything to do with that, but that's just a thing. Like, it seems like Mòrag personally wants to help Niall atone for the previous emperor's actions, and has a very strict sense of what royalty should be, as contrasted with Zeke, who doesn't really care about being royalty in the first place. She seems to distinguish pride of the Empire and pride of being an Ardainian from being proud of the Empire and the things that it's done. Honor is also a big deal for her. She probably sees a need to restore more Ardain's honor as a whole, while also upholding hers and Niall's. Despite being a military official herself, she's anti-war against Araya. There are plenty of senators who do want to fight them. There's an entire faction of the Senate that's pushing for that end. There's probably a lot of reasons. It could be, let's finish the job from before. They're just racist. They want more land. They want glory for themselves. That kind of stuff. But Mòrag more cares about the fact that it would definitely hurt the people of Mòrag in addition to any potential benefits, and the costs would probably outweigh them, given the precarious state the country's already in. In fact, the only reason she ever is antagonistic towards Rex is because she thinks the Aegis and then later Poppy are potential dangers to her people. As soon as she's able to figure out who the real threat is, and that Pyra and Mithra aren't attempting to do anything, she apologizes and changes sides, becoming one of Rex's most stalwart allies. This is also only kind of related, but it seems that out of all the party members, she's the one who's the most out of touch with just general life. She expresses interest in Fonset because she wants to know how common folk live, so it seems like she was living in royal luxury even during her time at Gormott, which, from what we see, isn't nearly as built up as Mòrag is. Although she is self-aware of this, and she expresses a desire to protect this way of life, it's clear that she wants to learn more about how these people live in order to do that, instead of a, oh, let me look down on the commoners type thing. She's probably the most politically savvy party member. Zeke is also royalty and had that upbringing too, but he's been away from home probably for as long as Niall's been on the throne of Mòrag. Mòrag's been doing this her entire life while Zeke intentionally left that life. And despite her desires for reform, she is still extremely entrenched in tradition and doing things by the book, this is how Mòrag should be way, as opposed to how it actually is. Overall, she has disdain for corruption and believes in straightforward dreamers like Rex over everything else, wishing the world would be a place where wishes and dreams like that are the go-to thing instead of having to get through all the political red tape to actually do stuff. Now, her biggest flaws are definitely her inability to just do something for herself instead of remaining completely dedicated to her job, and the fact that she takes pretty much everything too seriously. It's, of course, easy to see where both of those things come from based on her upbringing, but she takes everything as seriously as a matter of state. Plenty of heart-to-hearts are, let's put Mòrag in situation that is a lot more mundane or slice of life than she's usually in, and derive humor from the fact that she takes this as seriously as some military paperwork or whatever. That includes cooking, joking around with Zeke, just kind of hanging around with people and discussing things that aren't politics or the grand thing of the world. Bridget even calls her out for being terrible at telling jokes. Although, being around the rest of the party, and obviously Zeke, definitely helps her with this over time. She softens up a bit in general by the end. As she puts it, people like Rex and Zeke are good at getting stuff done, but someone needs to look to the details that they overlook. Also, she is overly competitive. She manages to turn the sense of wonder at looking down at the world from Elysium into a contest of who can spot the most titans in the most detail. And her only interest in Zeke before actually meeting him was she heard he was strong and wanted to try sparring with him. As for her relationship with Niall, she wants it to be closer than it is currently. She intentionally lets their stations get in the way of having a proper sibling relationship because she thinks it's improper of them, although in one heart-to-heart, either Mithra can yell at her to stop doing that or Pyra can convince her to stop doing that. She considers serving him and the Empire her greatest joy, and probably uses Rex as somewhat of a surrogate. He's almost certainly about the same age, and could be viewed as a version of Niall who is able to keep his optimism and the good part of youthful naivete, as opposed to the Emperor who obviously had to grow up faster, and while he still tries to do the right thing and get his dreams to go through, is a bit more pragmatic about things. I'm gonna have to bring this up because Xenogears did a thing like it too, but hopefully the fact that they're the only two remaining members of the royal family doesn't mean they're gonna end up having to be married at some point, because no, don't do that. Mòrag's biggest breakdown, the time she lets the overly serious facade slip the most, is when Niall seemingly dies, and after that it is very hard for him to convince her to go back to the party and leave his side. He does succeed though, and he's the only one who can get through her shell and force her to admit that yeah, she cares about those people, she wasn't just sticking with them for the good of the Empire, and that's kind of important. Even though she was trying to distance herself from him as a family member, he's still able to get under her skin and understand her as only a beloved brother could. That sort of thing. Another thing that I've never really talked about in these character discussions, but I think it's probably important to start now, is her sexuality. Because she's either currently in a relationship with Bridget, or has been too busy her entire life to even figure out what her sexuality is in the first place. In Korra's Blade Quest, she says that she's not particularly interested in relationships in general, and she's also extremely oblivious when it comes to certain implications of various romantic things. Like, in one heart-to-heart, she's trying to make a joke and says that she'd like to be buried the same style as Rex and Zeke want to, and everyone present takes that as her saying she wants to be buried next to them, and she doesn't realize the implication of that. So, that's some points for one thing, but then on the other hand, she's extremely close to Bridget. They're treated more or less the same as Zeke and Pandoria are, and they all but make Pandoria say she has feelings for Zeke. There's also the fact that Bridget is much more angsty about potentially forgetting Mòrag than she ever was about Hugo. In the heart-to-heart I mentioned before, where Pandoria comes to her for beauty advice, Mòrag misinterprets and initially thinks that Pandoria is coming on to her, and she's like, oh, I didn't realize, and is all flustered and stuff, so hey, there you go.
Without Bridget by my side, I can hardly call myself a special inquisitor, can I? Here, Bridget. We go together. Pride of the Empire emblazoned on our hearts.
As another aside, I'm imagining Mòrag going up to Niall after the story and being like, hey, now that the war and all this fighting is over and we have more land, maybe we could go into some social reforms. Have you considered repealing the law preventing humans and blades from marrying each other? And Naya's like, oh yes, of course, your dedication to the Aegis and her driver is admirable, that you're willing to ask for imperial law to be overturned to support them. And she's like, what the hell are you talking about? This is for me and Brigid. And because it's a medieval-inspired society, everyone wants to emulate the royals, so that instantly becomes a lot more normalized. And the thing with humans and blades marrying is kind of interesting, because it's like, we don't really know Alrest's stance on a lot of different things. Interracial marriages between different types of human is looked down upon mostly because Gormati don't really like Ardainians because of the colonization thing. Ardainians are racist towards Gormati. Oriya and Mòrag have that conflict. No one besides Napon wants to bone a Napon. So there's all that thing going. There also aren't really enough LGBT characters, besides like Sheba is the only really canon confirmed one, for us to know how they treat that. Like, it could be a more present-day, real-life situation where, oh, plenty of people look down on interracial marriages, but that's probably a smaller amount than the people who look down on same-sex marriages, and so forth, that kind of thing. Or it could be a different thing where, yeah, pretty much everyone's cool with LGBT people, but if you're an Ardainian boy, you can marry a man as long as it's not a Gormati man or an Orion man, that kind of thing. The real big barrier to entry with the humans marrying blades thing is, one, the fact that blades don't grow up, so some of them are children and stay children for decades, so you don't want any of that happening. This is why I say you loot the bird, I loot your corpse. And then there's also the fact that, okay, if you're a driver and you fall in love with your own blade, you are literally going to be together for the rest of your lives, that's fine, but what if you fall in love with someone else's blade, and like, I'm 20, falling in love with some 80-year-old's blade, that's not going to end very well. So there's those barriers to entry there, but they're just as human as all the other races of human, and once the whole prejudice thing stops, I don't really see that being an issue, so I don't know. There's probably a lot of politics and history behind all of this that's never really explored in the game, just because it's not relevant to any of the stories being told. Anyway, more reasons Mòrag is cool, because we haven't had enough of those already. She is the only party member to not have a gimmick that gives her some sort of extra edge in battle. Rex has the Aegis and is arguably a Blade Eater. Nia is a Flesh Eater and is one of the strongest ones of all time, or at least that we've seen. Tora built his blades himself, and being an artificial blade driver grants him certain bonuses and immunities to things that would affect normal drivers, so he has an edge there. Zeke is a Blade Eater. Mòrag is the only completely normal driver in the party, and with 100% pure skill, although to be fair, she has one of the more powerful blades, she is on the same level as everyone else. Endgame Rex obviously takes the cake, but he breaks more rules than there even are in the book, so I don't think that's too big of a stain on Mòrag's record. She's also so cool that the party doesn't really need to worry about diplomacy for the rest of the game once she joins, just because her being there dissuades any political entity from taking action against the party. Not just, oh, Mòrag's gonna get at us for this, but, oh crap, that's the Flamebringer, we actually know who she is compared to these other people, let's not mess with her. She lets herself get captured in Tantal, remember, and Amalthus doesn't really count, because Indal's at war with everyone at that point. It's not special to the party, he just kinda wants to watch the world burn. And that is the Mòrag video. I don't know if anyone was super excited to looking forward to this, but here it is. I hope you enjoyed this. Not really sure about what videos I'm making next. I'd love to make Xenosaga things, but I'm not done with episode 1 even yet, so like I said, it's gonna take a while. I'm kind of scared that Definitive Edition is gonna come out really soon and I'm not gonna even have time to finish the Xenosaga series by then, because I feel like that's a reasonable thing to do. Finish Xenosaga, then get to the Xenoblade 1 remake. I don't know. Anyway, until next time, this is Luxin, signing off.